The Widower's Christmas Wish, written by Violet Sinclair, narrated by Isadora Blythe. Chapter 1, December 20th, 1823, Rothbury Abbey. Lord Harrington wondered if 8-year-old Catherine would notice if he simply turned their carriage around and fled back to London. "Papa, you're doing that worried face again," Catherine observed from the seat beside him, her tone carrying the same gentle reproach her mother had once used. "Miss Pemberton said Christmas house parties are supposed to be jolly." "Of course they are, sweetheart." Richard forced his expression into something resembling paternal confidence as their carriage rounded the final bend toward Rothbury Abbey. "I was merely considering our arrangements." What he was actually considering was the disaster awaiting them. Catherine's governess had departed without notice 3 days ago. Something about a family emergency that couldn't wait until after Christmas, leaving Richard with a choice between disappointing his daughter or attending the Duchess of Rothbury's famous Christmas gathering with an 8-year-old and no proper supervision. Diana Rayborn had assured him that Catherine would be welcomed warmly, that there would be other children present, that it would be perfectly delightful. But Richard knew exactly what perfectly delightful meant when applied to his widowed state during the marriage season. Every unmarried lady at the party would view him as prime quarry. "Look, Papa!" Catherine pressed her nose to the carriage window as Rothbury Abbey came into view. "It's like a fairy tale castle." Richard had to admit the abbey looked magnificent in the late afternoon light. Ancient stone walls rose from snow-dusted grounds, while warm golden light spilled from every window. Wreaths adorned the entrance, and he could see the massive Christmas tree through the great hall windows, glittering with what appeared to be hundreds of candles. The scene was undeniably magical. It was also undeniably romantic, which was precisely the problem. Their carriage joined a line of elegant vehicles depositing guests at the main entrance. Richard recognized several crests: the Pembrys, the Sterlings, various other families from Diana's extensive social network, all people he respected, all families he trusted, all potential sources of well-meaning matrimonial interference. "Papa, why are you gripping the window frame?" Catherine asked with 8-year-old directness. Before Richard could answer, their carriage door opened and a footman appeared. "Lord Harrington? Her Grace is expecting you." There was no escape now. Richard helped Catherine down, accepted his walking stick from the footman, and steeled himself for a week of polite deflection and careful charm. At least Catherine would have a proper Christmas, which was worth any amount of personal discomfort. "Remember your manners, sweetheart," he murmured as they approached the entrance. "I always remember my manners," Catherine replied with dignity. "You're the one who gets tongue-tied around ladies." Richard nearly stumbled. "I do not get Lord Harrington." Diana Rayborn swept toward them through the entrance hall, magnificent in deep blue silk and genuine warmth. "How wonderful that you could join us. And this must be the famous Miss Catherine." Catherine executed a perfect curtsy. "Your Grace, thank you ever so much for inviting us to your Christmas party." "The pleasure is entirely ours, my dear." Diana's smile was radiant as she turned to Richard. "Richard, you look well, and slightly terrified, which is perfectly normal for first-time Christmas guests. Gabriel was the same way our first year hosting." "I'm not terrified," Richard protested, then caught Catherine's skeptical look, perhaps mildly apprehensive. "Excellent. Apprehension keeps things interesting." Diana gestured toward the bustling hall where guests were arriving and greeting each other with Christmas cheer. "Now, I have someone particular I'd like you both to meet. Miss Mitchell has been such a delightful addition to our party, and I think you'll find her quite refreshing." Something in Diana's tone made Richard's apprehension spike. "Miss Mitchell?" "An American lady visiting from Boston. Such an accomplished young woman. She runs a school for young ladies there. Educational theory, modern teaching methods, absolutely fascinating perspectives on children's development." Richard felt his stomach sink. An American bluestocking with strong opinions about child rearing was exactly the sort of person Diana would consider perfect for his situation. How educational. "Oh, Papa," Catherine whispered, tugging at his sleeve. "Look at all the Christmas decorations." Richard followed his daughter's gaze and had to admit the abbey was spectacular. Garlands of evergreen wound around the grand staircase. Massive arrangements of holly and ivy adorned every surface, and the scent of cinnamon and oranges filled the air. Through the open doors to the great hall, he could see the enormous Christmas tree Diana had mentioned, surrounded by wrapped packages and what appeared to be a small army of children. "Miss Mitchell," Diana called toward a group near the Christmas tree. "Come meet our newest arrivals." Richard braced himself for the inevitable encounter with Diana's chosen candidate for his affections. He developed a sixth sense for these introductions over the past 3 years of widowerhood. The careful emphasis on a lady's accomplishments, the meaningful glances, the strategic positioning. But when Miss Mitchell turned around, Richard's prepared politeness died completely. She was not what he'd expected at all. Where he'd anticipated a stern blue stocking with sharp features and disapproving eyes, he found a woman with warm brown hair escaping from a simple chignon, laughing brown eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, and a dusting of what appeared to be flour on her dark green dress. She was holding the hand of a small boy who couldn't have been more than 5, while a girl about Catherine's age clung to her other arm. "Miss Sarah Mitchell," Diana said with obvious satisfaction. "May I present Lord Harrington and his daughter Catherine. Richard, Sarah has been helping organize the children's Christmas activities. She has the most wonderful ideas about engaging young minds." Sarah Mitchell stepped forward with a directness that was unmistakably American, extending her hand in a way that would have scandalized his mother but somehow charmed him completely. "Lord Harrington," she said, her voice carrying the crisp accent of New England. "Catherine, what a pleasure to meet you both. I've heard so much about you from Her Grace." "Miss Mitchell." Richard found himself taking her offered hand, noting the calluses that spoke of practical work rather than idle accomplishment. Her grip was firm, confident, refreshingly honest. "Diana mentioned you're from Boston?" "Born and raised. I run a small academy for young ladies there, though run might be generous. We're still quite new." Her smile was self-deprecating in a way that suggested genuine humility rather than false modesty. "I'm visiting England to observe different educational methods. The Duchess was kind enough to include me in her Christmas celebrations." "Miss Mitchell knows ever so many games," the little boy announced, still clutching her hand. "She taught us paper folding and Christmas riddles and how to make snow angels properly." Catherine's eyes lit up. "Snow angels? Oh, Papa, might we learn too?" "Of course you may," Sarah said before Richard could answer. "Though I should warn you, proper snow angel technique requires a great deal of lying about in the snow. Your father may not approve." Richard found himself smiling despite his earlier apprehension. "I believe Catherine can manage a little snow. She's hardier than she appears." "All the best people are," Sarah replied, and something in her tone suggested she was including him in that assessment. "Miss Mitchell," Catherine said with 8-year-old determination, "would you like to see my Christmas doll? Mama gave her to me for my last Christmas with her before she went to heaven, and she has the most beautiful dress." Richard felt his chest tighten at the casual mention of Elizabeth. Catherine spoke of her mother with such simple acceptance, but for him the pain was still sharp enough to steal his breath. "I would love to see your doll," Sarah said gently. "What's her name?" "Rosalind, after the lady in Papa's favorite Shakespeare play. He reads it to me sometimes, though I don't understand all the words." "As you like it," Sarah said with surprise, glancing at Richard. "How wonderful that you share Shakespeare with her." "Elizabeth always said children could appreciate beauty even when they don't understand every nuance," Richard managed, touched that Catherine remembered. Something soft crossed Sarah's expression. "Your wife sounds like she was a very wise woman." The simple acknowledgement, free from pity or awkward consolation, did something unexpected to Richard's carefully guarded heart. Most people either avoided mentioning Elizabeth entirely or overwhelmed him with sympathy that only made the loss feel heavier. "She was," he said quietly. "She would have adored this Christmas gathering." "Then we shall have to make it especially magical in her honor," Sarah replied matter-of-factly. "Catherine, shall we go find your room so you can introduce me to Rosalind properly and then perhaps I can show you the Christmas preparations and introduce you to the other children." Catherine beamed and slipped her hand into Sarah's with the trusting ease that had been her gift since birth. "Oh, yes, and Miss Mitchell, will you help me write my letter to Father Christmas? I want to make sure I ask for exactly the right thing." As Richard watched his daughter chatter excitedly while leading this remarkable American woman toward the stairs, he realized Diana's matchmaking might be more dangerous than he'd anticipated. Not because Sarah Mitchell was unsuitable, quite the opposite, because for the first time in 3 years, he found himself wondering what it might feel like to stop being careful and start hoping again. Chapter 2. Sarah Mitchell stood at the window of the charming blue guest room, watching Lord Harrington's daughter sleep in the adjoining bed, and tried to ignore the uncomfortable tug in her chest. Catherine had fallen asleep clutching the porcelain doll, Rosalind, while describing in vivid detail how her mama used to brush the doll's hair each night. The child's easy acceptance of her mother's death was both heartbreaking and admirable, but what unsettled Sarah most was her own unexpected urge to smooth the little girl's dark curls and promise that everything would be well. "This is temporary," Sarah reminded herself firmly. 3 weeks in England, observe their educational methods, then home to Boston and the Mitchell Academy for Young Ladies. The school she'd spent 2 years planning waited for her return. She had prospective students, interested investors, and a lease on the perfect building near Boston Common. Her entire future was mapped out with the precision she'd learned from years of managing other people's children while building toward her own dreams. She had no business feeling maternal toward a child she'd known for 4 hours. Even less business noticing that Catherine's father possessed the most appealingly gentle manner she'd encountered in any country. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Miss Mitchell? Are you settled comfortably?" Lord Harrington's voice carried through the door with that careful politeness she was beginning to recognize as his armor against the world. Sarah opened the door to find him standing in the corridor, still formally dressed despite the late hour. His dark hair was slightly mussed, the first sign of anything less than perfect control she'd seen from him. "Perfectly settled, thank you. Catherine is fast asleep. She was quite exhausted from the excitement. She always is after meeting new people. Elizabeth used to say Catherine collected friends the way other children collected toys." His expression softened with memory. "Thank you for being so kind to her today. The transition from governess to governess has been difficult. Children adapt more easily than we expect, in my experience, though consistency helps." Sarah studied his face, noting the worry lines around his eyes. "How many governesses has she had?" 3. In 18 months. Lord Harrington's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The first found her position with a family more suited to her temperament. The second married quite suddenly. Miss Hartwell departed Tuesday without explanation. Sarah's professional instincts sharpened. "That's rather unusual. May I ask, forgive the directness, but it's an American failing, is Catherine difficult to manage?" "Quite the opposite. She's intelligent, well-behaved, eager to please." His voice carried a note of frustrated bewilderment. "I can't determine what I'm doing wrong." "Perhaps," Sarah said carefully, "the issue isn't what you're doing wrong, but what the governesses expected versus what Catherine needs." Lord Harrington's eyebrows rose. "Meaning?" "An 8-year-old who's lost her mother needs emotional security as much as educational instruction. Some governesses prefer children who require less investment." "Investment?" Catherine talks about her mother openly, naturally. She grieves honestly. That requires a governess willing to acknowledge loss rather than simply redirecting attention to lessons. Sarah adjusted her spectacles, a nervous habit when discussing professional opinions. "In my experience, children who feel safe expressing their feelings adapt better than those taught to suppress them." Lord Harrington stared at her for a long moment. "You believe Catherine's honesty about Elizabeth drives governesses away?" "I believe some people are uncomfortable with authentic emotion, especially from children. They prefer politeness to honesty." Sarah realized she might have overstepped. "Forgive me, I shouldn't presume." "No, please continue. This is the first explanation that makes sense. His genuine interest encouraged her. Children. Catherine's age need adults who won't disappear when emotions become complicated. Governesses who view grief as something to be fixed rather than supported will always find the position challenging. And you don't view her grief as something requiring repair? I view it as proof she was deeply loved. That's not something to fix, it's something to honor. Lord Harrington's expression shifted, and Sarah caught a glimpse of something vulnerable beneath his polished exterior. The agency assured me they were providing experienced women. Experience with obedient children who don't ask difficult questions, perhaps. Catherine asks wonderful questions. She asked me yesterday why God needed Mama in heaven when she needed her more here. Sarah's heart clenched. What did you tell her? That I didn't know, but we would love her enough for both of us until we understood. His voice was rough. Miss Thornbury informed me such responses were spiritually inadequate and encouraged morbid thinking. Miss Thornbury was an idiot, Sarah said with more heat than intended. Lord Harrington blinked, then laughed, a real laugh that transformed his careful expression completely. Miss Mitchell, that may be the most refreshing thing anyone has said to me in months. American failing number 2. I express opinions too freely. I'm beginning to think American failings might be precisely what we need. The words hung between them, charged with possibility that made Sarah's pulse quicken. She found herself studying his face, the laugh lines around his eyes, the way his mouth curved when he forgot to be careful, the obvious love he felt for his daughter. Stop it, she warned herself. This is not why you came to England. How long will you be visiting? Lord Harrington asked, as if reading her thoughts. I sail home January 4th. The spring term at my academy begins in February, and I have much to prepare. The words felt oddly heavy leaving her lips. This Christmas gathering is my final English experience before returning to my real life. Something flickered across his expression. Disappointment, perhaps, or relief. She couldn't tell which possibility bothered her more. Your academy? He said. Tell me about it. Sarah launched into her practice description of the Mitchell Academy, the curriculum designed to prepare young women for meaningful work, the emphasis on practical skills alongside traditional accomplishments, the financial independence she'd fought to achieve. But as she spoke, she found herself watching Lord Harrington's face, noting his genuine interest in her professional aspirations. Most English gentlemen glazed over when she discussed women's education. He leaned forward, asked thoughtful questions, treated her ambitions as seriously as she did. It sounds remarkable, he said when she finished. Boston is fortunate to have such an advocate for young women's minds. England could use similar institutions. The young ladies I've met here are intelligent, but their education seems designed to make them ornamental rather than useful. Including Catherine's education? Sarah realized the trap too late. I didn't mean, your daughter is clearly what? Brilliant, curious, full of questions that deserve thoughtful answers rather than deflection. Sarah met his gaze directly. But she'll need more than accomplishments if she hopes to navigate the world as an independent woman. Independent? Lord Harrington's voice carried a note of surprise. She's 8 years old. She's 8 years old now, but someday she'll be 18 and then 28, and she'll need to know her own mind rather than simply please others. You speak as though marriage isn't her ultimate destination. Marriage may be wonderful, but it shouldn't be her only option. Sarah adjusted her spectacles again. What if she never finds a man worthy of her? What if she chooses a different path entirely? Shouldn't she be prepared for any future? Lord Harrington was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with those dark eyes that seemed to see more than she intended. You sound as though you speak from experience. I am 26 years old, unmarried by choice, and supporting myself through work I find meaningful. In Boston, that's unusual but not scandalous. Here. Sarah gestured toward the elegant corridor. I suspect it's viewed quite differently. Here, it would be considered remarkable, he said quietly, and rather brave. The unexpected compliment made warmth bloom in her chest. Thank you. You're welcome. He paused, then asked, Have you never wished for marriage? Children of your own? The question she'd been asked countless times, usually with pity or confusion. But from Lord Harrington, it felt like genuine curiosity rather than judgment. I've never found a man who wanted a partner rather than an ornament. American men talk of equality but still expect their wives to abandon their own interests for domestic service. Sarah considered her words carefully. I'd rather remain independent than sacrifice my mind for the sake of a wedding ring. And if you found a man who valued your mind, then I suppose I'd have to decide whether love was worth the risk of losing myself. Lord Harrington's gaze intensified. Is that what marriage means to you? Losing yourself? Isn't that what it meant for most women? Even the happiest wives I know exist primarily as extensions of their husbands' lives. Elizabeth never lost herself, he said softly. She became more herself. Marriage gave her freedom to be everything she was, not less. Sarah felt something shift in her chest at the way he spoke of his late wife. With love, yes, but also with respect that suggested true partnership. She sounds like an extraordinary woman. She was. But she wasn't extraordinary because she abandoned her own interests. She was extraordinary because she found someone who encouraged them. The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Sarah found herself wondering what it might feel like to be encouraged rather than merely tolerated, supported rather than simply accepted. Dangerous thoughts, she warned herself. You have a life waiting in Boston. But as Lord Harrington bid her good night and disappeared down the corridor, Sarah remained at the window, staring out at the snow beginning to fall, and wondering why her carefully planned future suddenly felt less appealing than the uncertain possibilities of an English Christmas. Chapter 3. Richard woke to the sound of his daughter's laughter, echoing through the corridors of Rothbury Abbey, a sound that had become increasingly rare since Miss Thornbury's departure. He found Catherine in the breakfast room, regaling the Duke of Rothbury with animated descriptions of paper angel construction, while Miss Mitchell calmly buttered toast and offered encouraging murmurs. The domestic scene should have felt ordinary. Instead, it made something twist uncomfortably in his chest. "Papa!" Catherine bounced from her chair the moment she spotted him. Miss Mitchell knows how to make paper angels that actually look like angels instead of crumpled disasters. And she says we can make them for everyone's Christmas gifts. How industrious, Richard replied, accepting coffee from a footman while studying Sarah Mitchell's profile. In morning light streaming through the windows, she looked younger than he'd first assumed, perhaps closer to 25 than 30. Her brown hair caught golden highlights, and when she glanced up to greet him, her spectacles couldn't hide the warmth in her dark eyes. Lord Harrington, she said with that direct American manner that was growing dangerously appealing. I hope you don't mind Catherine's early enthusiasm for craft projects. Not at all. Though I should warn you, Catherine's artistic ambitions often exceed her execution abilities. I do not, Catherine protested with 8-year-old indignation. I'm very good at arts. Tell him, Miss Mitchell. Sarah's mouth curved in a smile that made Richard's pulse stutter. Catherine has excellent fine motor control and remarkable patience. Her angels will be beautiful because she cares about the results. The simple praise made Catherine beam, but it was Sarah's matter-of-fact confidence in his daughter that caught Richard's attention. Not false encouragement or condescending sweetness, genuine recognition of Catherine's capabilities. Miss Mitchell, Gabriel Rothbury said from his position at the head of the table, I understand you're developing curriculum for young ladies' education. Diana mentioned your academy focuses on practical skills. Among other things, your grace. We teach traditional accomplishments, but also mathematics, natural philosophy, and basic accounting. Young women should understand the world they inhabit, not merely ornament it. Fascinating approach, Gabriel replied with genuine interest. And you find American families receptive to such comprehensive education for daughters? More receptive than I initially expected. Parents want their children prepared for whatever future they might face. Sarah's gaze flicked briefly to Richard. Uncertainty makes practical skills valuable. Richard found himself leaning forward. What sort of practical skills? Household management that includes understanding expenses rather than simply spending them. Basic legal knowledge about property and inheritance. simple medical care beyond fainting remedies. Sarah's voice grew passionate, skills that make women capable rather than merely decorative. Catherine learns writing and French and watercolors, Richard said carefully. All lovely accomplishments. But can she calculate the cost of feeding a horse for a year? Does she understand why French might be useful beyond drawing room conversation? Could she teach watercolor techniques to earn income if necessary? The questions weren't critical, they were thoughtful, designed to expand his thinking rather than diminish his parenting. Richard realized he was genuinely curious about her answers. I confess I hadn't considered the practical applications. Most parents don't, but Elizabeth's death taught Catherine that security can disappear unexpectedly. Shouldn't her education reflect that reality? The casual mention of his wife's name, free from awkward sympathy or careful avoidance, did something unexpected to the careful walls Richard had built around his grief. Sarah Mitchell spoke of Elizabeth as though she were a real person with relevant opinions, rather than a painful memory to be managed. Elizabeth would have appreciated your perspective, he found himself saying. She often complained that her own education prepared her for ornamental living rather than practical partnership. Then perhaps Catherine's education could honor her memory by preparing her for anything. Before Richard could respond, Diana swept into the breakfast room with obvious excitement. Wonderful news, everyone. The weather promises to be perfect for our village expedition this morning. We'll visit the Christmas market, attend service at St. Stephen's, and complete our gift shopping before tomorrow's storm. Storm? Richard asked with mild alarm. Oh yes, didn't I mention? The most delightful blizzard is expected tomorrow evening. We'll be completely snowed in for several days. Quite cozy and romantic. Diana's smile was far too satisfied. Perfect for Christmas week activities. Richard caught Sarah's slight frown and realized she was calculating travel implications. Her ship departed January 4th. A Christmas week snowstorm could complicate her journey to London, potentially threatening her return passage. How long are storms typically expected to last? Sarah asked with careful neutrality. Oh, one never knows, Diana replied airily. Sometimes they clear quickly, sometimes they linger for weeks, but that's what makes Christmas house parties so delightful. One simply surrenders to circumstance and enjoys whatever develops. The words surrenders to circumstance made Richard's stomach clench. Sarah Mitchell needed to return to Boston on schedule. Her academy, her students, her entire future depended on that January departure. But as he watched Catherine chatter excitedly about Christmas market visits, while Sarah listened with patient attention, Richard realized his own problem was becoming more complicated by the hour. He was beginning to hope the storm would last forever. 20 minutes later, bundled in greatcoats and scarves, the house party guests made their way through crisp morning air toward the village of Little Rothbury. Richard found himself walking beside Sarah while Catherine skipped ahead with the other children, her delight in the expedition infectious. She's adapting beautifully, Sarah observed, watching Catherine examine icicles hanging from tree branches. Children often surprise us with their resilience. Elizabeth used to say Catherine collected joy the way other people collected grievances. A wonderful trait to inherit. They walked in comfortable silence for several moments before Richard found himself asking, "What will you miss most about England when you return to Boston?" Sarah was quiet for so long, he thought she might not answer. Finally, she said, "The children here ask different questions than American children. More thoughtful, perhaps, less hurried. And what will you be most eager to return to?" Another pause. Independence, the freedom to make decisions without consulting anyone else's expectations. That sounds rather lonely. Sarah's step faltered almost imperceptibly. Lonely and safe aren't the same thing. Before Richard could pursue that intriguing statement, Catherine's voice carried back to them. "Papa, Miss Mitchell, come see the Christmas puddings in the bakery window." As they hurried to catch up with the children, Richard found himself studying Sarah's profile and wondering what had made her equate independence with safety, and why the thought of her sailing away in 2 weeks made him want to find a way to make England feel safe enough for her to stay. Chapter 4. Sarah stood at the great hall windows watching the first fat snowflakes begin to fall, and tried to convince herself the tightness in her chest was concern about travel delays rather than anticipation. The morning's village expedition had been dangerously perfect. Lord Harrington proved an attentive companion who listened to her opinions about children's education without the patronizing indulgence she'd come to expect from English gentlemen. Catherine had chosen Christmas gifts with thoughtful care. A book of pressed flowers for Miss Mitchell because you like learning things, and a new pipe for her father because Mama always said you needed something to help you think quietly. Now the promised storm was beginning, and Sarah found herself torn between practical worry and shameful excitement about being snowed in with a man whose gentle intelligence was becoming increasingly difficult to resist. "The children are beside themselves with delight," Eleanor Blackwood observed, settling beside Sarah with a cup of tea. The Countess of Blackwood had been nothing but kind since Sarah's arrival, treating her American directness as refreshing rather than shocking. "Thomas is organizing a snow sculpture competition for tomorrow morning." "Catherine will adore that. She has strong opinions about artistic authenticity," Eleanor laughed. "She gets that from her father. Richard always was particular about details." She paused, studying Sarah with artistic eyes. "He seems quite taken with your educational theories. He's a devoted father. Most parents are interested in their children's development." "Most parents, yes. But Richard doesn't usually engage in passionate philosophical discussions with governesses." Heat rose in Sarah's cheeks. "I'm not a governess, Lady Blackwood." "No, you're something far more dangerous. A woman who makes him think." Eleanor's voice carried gentle amusement. "Forgive my presumption, but I've known Richard since before his marriage. I've never seen him so animated in a lady's presence." Sarah's pulse quickened despite her efforts at composure. "He's simply being courteous to a guest. Courtesy doesn't make a man's eyes light up when discussing mathematics instruction." Before Sarah could formulate a response that wasn't mortifyingly revealing, Catherine's voice echoed through the hall. "Miss Mitchell, Papa, come quickly. The snow is getting properly deep." Sarah found Catherine pressed against the tall windows, breath fogging the glass as she watched the rapidly accumulating snow. Lord Harrington appeared beside his daughter, and Sarah couldn't help noticing how his presence seemed to calm some restless energy she hadn't realized she was carrying. "It's beautiful," Catherine breathed. "Mama loved the first real snow of winter. She said it made the world look like a fairy tale." "Your mother had excellent taste in weather," Sarah said, earning one of Catherine's delighted grins. "Miss Mitchell, will you help me make snow angels tomorrow? Proper ones, like you promised? If the storm permits, I'd be delighted." "Papa could help too. He's very tall, so his angels would be enormous." Lord Harrington's eyes met Sarah's over Catherine's head, and something warm passed between them that had nothing to do with snow angels and everything to do with the domestic intimacy of planning tomorrow together. "I'm not certain my dignity could survive snow angel construction," he said solemnly, though his eyes held laughter. "Dignity is overrated," Sarah replied before she could stop herself. "Joy is much more important." "Spoken like a true American," he said, and for once the observation felt like a compliment rather than cultural classification. The afternoon continued with cozy contentment. Tea by the fire, charades with the other guests, Catherine's delighted participation in Christmas carol singing. Sarah found herself repeatedly catching Lord Harrington's gaze during group activities, sharing small smiles over Catherine's enthusiasm or exchanging amused glances when other guests made particularly dramatic performances. By evening, the snow was falling heavily enough to muffle sound and transform the Abbey grounds into something magical. Sarah stood at her bedroom window watching the world disappear under white, trying to calculate how long such weather might delay London travel. A soft knock interrupted her calculations. "Miss Mitchell?" Lord Harrington's voice carried through the door. "Might I speak with you briefly? Catherine is asking for you." Sarah opened the door to find him looking genuinely concerned. "Is she unwell?" "Not unwell, precisely, but she's unsettled about something. She asked specifically for you rather than her father, which is unusual." Following him down the corridor, Sarah realized this was the first time Catherine had chosen her comfort over her beloved papa's. The responsibility felt both honored and weighted. She found Catherine sitting up in bed, clutching Rosalind and looking younger than her 8 years. "Miss Mitchell," Catherine said with relief, "I was worried you might leave early because of the storm." Sarah settled on the edge of the bed. "What makes you think I would leave early?" "Miss Thornbury left early, and Miss Whitmore, and Miss Henley. They always found reasons to leave when things got difficult." Sarah's heart ached for this child who'd learned to expect abandonment. What sort of difficult things? "When I asked too many questions about Mama, or when I felt sad and couldn't stop crying, or when I had dreams and needed someone to sit with me until I felt brave again." Behind them, Lord Harrington made a sound like a man taking a physical blow. Sarah didn't turn, but she heard him sink into the chair beside the fireplace. "Catherine," Sarah said gently, "what would you like me to do when you feel sad or have dreams that frighten you?" "Stay with me until it passes." "Of course I'll stay. Sad feelings and scary dreams are part of being human. They don't make you difficult, they make you normal." Catherine's shoulders relaxed visibly. "Miss Thornbury said good children don't burden adults with emotional displays." "Miss Thornbury was wrong about many things," Sarah said firmly. "Good children are honest about their feelings. Good adults help them feel safe while they experience those feelings." "Even if I cry?" "Especially if you cry. Tears are how hearts heal." Catherine studied Sarah's face with 8-year-old seriousness. "Will you stay at Rothbury Abbey, even after Christmas?" The innocent question hit Sarah like cold water. She was acutely aware of Lord Harrington listening from his chair, of the snow falling outside that might delay her departure, of the impossible choice crystallizing before her. "Catherine, I have commitments in America, a school that needs me, students who are counting on me." "But couldn't you teach children here too? There are lots of children who need learning." Sarah glanced toward Lord Harrington, surprised by Catherine's simple logic. "It's not that simple, sweetheart. I have commitments in America. People are counting on me." "Oh." Catherine considered this with 8-year-old seriousness. "That's sad for the children here, though." Out of the mouths of babes. Sarah felt her carefully constructed arguments crumbling under the weight of a child's logic and a man's hopeful silence. "Let's focus on tonight," she said finally. "Tomorrow we'll make snow angels and help with Christmas preparations. The future can wait for Christmas to pass." Catherine nodded, apparently satisfied with the postponement. "Will you tell me a story about America? I want to understand where you come from." As Sarah launched into tales of Boston Harbor and autumn maple trees, she was hyper-aware of Lord Harrington's presence in the chair behind her. When Catherine finally drifted to sleep, Sarah turned to find him watching her with an expression of quiet gratitude. "Thank you," he said softly. She needed that reassurance. She needed to know someone would stay when things became difficult. "It means a great deal to her, and to me." The simple acknowledgement made warmth spread through Sarah's chest. "She's easy to care about." "Yes," he said, his voice carrying something deeper. "She is." Sarah realized they were speaking about more than Catherine's lovable nature, and the air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken possibility. She stood quickly, needing distance before she did something foolish. "I should let you say good night to her." "Of course." But he made no immediate move to take her place beside Catherine's bed. "Sarah?" Her name on his lips made her pulse skip. "Yes?" "Thank you, for today, for understanding her." As she slipped out of Catherine's room and back to her own, Sarah realized the storm outside was nothing compared to the one building in her chest, equal parts terror and anticipation about what tomorrow might bring. Chapter 5. Richard woke to the sound of howling wind and something that felt suspiciously like relief. The storm had arrived with a vengeance during the night, transforming Rothbury Abbey into an island surrounded by drifts that reached the ground floor windows. Through his bedroom window, he could see nothing but white. No roads, no boundaries, no escape routes for anxious guests who might suddenly discover pressing business elsewhere. Including Miss Sarah Mitchell, whose ship departure was looking increasingly uncertain. The thought should have concerned him. Instead, it made him smile as he dressed with unusual care for breakfast. He found the great hall buzzing with excited energy. Children pressed their faces to every available window. Adults clustered around the Duke's weather reports, and servants moved efficiently to accommodate the reality of unexpected captivity. Lord Harrington? Diana swept toward him with obvious delight. Isn't this perfectly romantic? We're completely snowed in until Christmas passes, perhaps longer. Romantic wasn't the word Richard would have chosen. Cozy, perhaps, or intimate, or, if he was being honest, providential. "Where might I find Miss Mitchell?" he asked, scanning the assembled guests. "Kitchen, I believe. She volunteered to help with Christmas pudding preparation since our original plans required village supplies we can no longer obtain." Diana's smile turned knowing. Such a practical young woman, and so good with children. Richard made his way toward the kitchen, following the sound of laughter and the scent of cinnamon and brandy. He paused in the doorway, taking in a scene that made something warm unfurl in his chest. Sarah stood at the massive wooden table, sleeves rolled up and apron tied over her morning dress, surrounded by children ranging from Catherine's age to barely walking. She was demonstrating the proper technique for stirring Christmas pudding while keeping up a running commentary that had everyone giggling. "The secret," she was saying, "is to stir clockwise and make a wish with each turn. But the wishes must be Christmas wishes, kind thoughts for people you care about." "What kind of wishes?" asked little James Pembry, one of Lucy's twins. "Wishes for someone else's happiness. That your papa gets his favorite book for Christmas, or that your mama's roses bloom beautifully next spring." Catherine, standing on a wooden stool beside Sarah, announced solemnly, "I'm wishing for Miss Mitchell to have the best Christmas ever." Sarah's stirring faltered for just a moment. "That's a lovely wish, Catherine. What are you wishing, Miss Mitchell?" Richard found himself holding his breath, unreasonably invested in her answer. "I'm wishing," Sarah said carefully, "for everyone in this kitchen to feel loved and happy this Christmas." It was a diplomatic response that avoided personal revelation, but Richard caught the way her gaze flickered toward him as she spoke. The brief contact sent heat racing through him that had nothing to do with the warm kitchen. "Papa!" Catherine spotted him in the doorway. "Come help with pudding wishes. Miss Mitchell says everyone must take a turn or Christmas won't be properly magical." Sarah looked up, flour dusting her cheek and spectacles slightly askew from kitchen steam. She looked utterly charming and completely unlike any governess he'd ever encountered. "I wouldn't want to interfere with kitchen magic," Richard said, stepping into the warm chaos. "Nonsense," Sarah replied, handing him the wooden spoon. "Christmas pudding is democratic. Everyone contributes to the luck." Her fingers brushed his as she transferred the spoon, and Richard felt the contact like lightning. From her sharp intake of breath, she felt it too. "What do I wish for?" he asked, hyper-aware of her proximity as she guided his stirring technique. "Something for someone else's happiness," she said softly. "Something kind." Richard closed his eyes, stirring the rich mixture while acutely conscious of Sarah's warmth beside him, Catherine's excited breathing, the domestic contentment surrounding them. When he opened his eyes, he found Sarah watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "What did you wish?" Catherine asked with curiosity. "That someone I care about gets everything she deserves for Christmas." The words were meant for Catherine, but Richard's gaze was fixed on Sarah as he spoke. Her cheeks flushed pink, and she looked away quickly, busying herself with measuring spices. "My turn," Catherine announced, claiming the spoon with 8-year-old authority. As the children took turns with wishes and giggles, Richard worked beside Sarah in easy partnership, holding bowls, measuring ingredients, maintaining the cheerful chaos that seemed to energize rather than exhaust her. "You're very good at this," he observed, as she efficiently managed 6 children and pudding construction simultaneously. "Kitchen democracy. Everyone helps, everyone benefits." She passed him a bowl of chopped fruit, much more effective than hierarchical instruction. "Is that how you run your academy? Democratically?" "Within reason. Young women learn better when they feel heard rather than simply lectured." Sarah's passion for her work was evident in every word. Traditional education treats students like empty vessels to be filled. I prefer to think of them as gardens to be cultivated. Richard studied her animated face, noting how her eyes lit up when discussing education, how her gestures became more expansive when explaining her theories. Sarah Mitchell talking about teaching was magnetic in a way that made him forget entirely about careful emotional distance. Your students are fortunate to have someone so devoted to their development. They're depending on me to return with new methods, fresh perspectives. The reminders seemed to dim her enthusiasm slightly. I promised the parents their daughters would receive the most comprehensive education available. And they will, whether in Boston or... Richard let the sentence hang, dangerous territory he had no business exploring. Sarah met his gaze directly. Or, nothing. I merely meant that excellent teachers are valuable anywhere. Are you suggesting I consider teaching in England permanently? The directness of the question caught him off guard. I'm suggesting nothing, merely observing that Catherine has learned more from you in 2 days than from any governess in 18 months. That's not a reason to abandon my life's work. Of course not. Forgive me, I didn't mean to imply. Papa, Catherine interrupted with perfect timing, the pudding is ready for wishes from the grown-ups now. Sarah turned back to the pudding mixture, but Richard caught the tension in her shoulders, the careful way she avoided his gaze. He'd overstepped somehow, implied too much too soon. But as the morning progressed, children decorating the kitchen, adults sampling Christmas treats, Sarah seamlessly organizing activities that kept everyone engaged, Richard couldn't stop watching her natural authority and wondering what it might mean to have such a partner in life. When the kitchen finally emptied for lunch, Sarah remained behind to clean up. Richard lingered as well, ostensibly to help, but really because he couldn't bring himself to leave her company. Well, Sarah said, surveying the flour-dusted kitchen with satisfaction, that was considerably more entertaining than most cooking lessons. Catherine will remember this Christmas pudding for years. Richard helped her carry bowls to the washing basin. You have a gift with children. They respond to being treated as capable rather than fragile. She wiped her hands on her apron, leaving a streak of flour on her cheek that made her look charmingly disheveled. Speaking of capable, I believe someone promised snow angels once the storm settles. Ah, yes, my dignity's ultimate test. Sarah laughed, the sound warming the cozy kitchen. I have an even better idea. The Duke mentioned there are old sleds in the stable from when he and his siblings were children. Once the wind dies down. You want to go sledding? I want to see if English hills are as thrilling as New England ones. Her eyes sparkled with mischief behind her spectacles. Unless English gentlemen consider such activities beneath their dignity? English gentlemen, Richard said, stepping closer without quite realizing it, occasionally enjoy having their dignity thoroughly challenged. How fortunate, because I intend to challenge it quite thoroughly. The promise in her voice made something warm and reckless stir in Richard's chest. Miss Mitchell, are you always so determined to corrupt proper behavior? Only when proper behavior looks desperately in need of corrupting. Outside, the wind continued howling, but the kitchen felt warm and intimate and full of possibility. Richard realized he was standing close enough to see the gold flecks in Sarah's brown eyes, to catch the faint scent of vanilla and cinnamon that clung to her hair. I should warn you, he said quietly. I haven't been sledding since I was Catherine's age. Then it's time you remembered how to play Lord Harrington. The way she said his name, half challenge, half invitation, made Richard wonder if sledding was the only thing she intended to teach him to rediscover. Tomorrow, then, he agreed, when the storm passes. Tomorrow, Sarah confirmed, but neither of them moved to leave the cozy kitchen, both reluctant to break the spell of flour dust and shared laughter that had settled around them like Christmas magic. Chapter 6. Sarah had forgotten how exhilarating winter could be. The storm had blown itself out by midday, leaving Rothbury Abbey surrounded by pristine snow that sparkled like diamonds in the afternoon sun. The sledding hill behind the abbey stretched invitingly downward, and Sarah felt her pulse quicken with an anticipation that had nothing to do with childhood memories. Well, perhaps not entirely nothing. Miss Mitchell, you look positively dangerous. Lord Harrington observed as she examined the ancient wooden sled the Duke's footman had retrieved from the stables. His tone was teasing, but when she glanced up, something heated in his dark eyes that made her breath catch. Dangerous, how exactly? Like a woman planning mischief. He moved closer, ostensibly to test the sled's runners, but close enough that she caught his scent. Sandalwood and winter air, and something indefinably masculine that made her stomach flutter. Should I be concerned for my safety? Probably. Sarah grinned, feeling reckless in a way that was becoming dangerously addictive. I should warn you, I'm quite competitive about outdoor activities. Are you indeed? His smile was slow, devastating. How fortunate that I don't mind losing to a worthy opponent. Catherine's delighted shriek interrupted whatever Sarah might have said in response. Papa, Miss Mitchell, look how deep the snow is. I can barely walk. Sure enough, Catherine was struggling through drifts that nearly reached her waist, her cheeks pink with cold and excitement. Sarah felt a pang of maternal concern that was becoming troublingly natural. Catherine, stay closer to the path, Lord Harrington called. The drifts are deeper than they appear. I want to build a snowman, a huge one. Will you help? After sledding, Sarah promised. Find a good spot near those trees where the snow isn't quite so deep. Catherine nodded importantly and trudged toward the suggested area, immediately absorbed in her architectural planning. Sarah watched her go with fond exasperation, then turned to find Lord Harrington studying her with an unreadable expression. What? You're very natural with her. Protective, but not confining. She makes it easy to be protective. The truth slipped out before Sarah could stop it, and she saw Lord Harrington's expression shift into something that made her pulse race. Does she? His voice had grown softer, more intent. Or do you simply understand what people need when they're vulnerable? The question hung between them, and Sarah realized he was asking about more than Catherine's needs. He was asking whether she understood his own careful defenses, his own need for someone who wouldn't disappear when emotions became complicated. I think, Sarah said carefully, that most people need to feel safe before they can be honest about what they want. Sarah cleared her throat, needing to break the tension before she did something foolish. Shall we test this sled before it falls apart entirely? After you, Miss Mitchell, though I reserve the right to catch you if disaster strikes. How very gallant, but I suspect I can manage. Sarah positioned herself at the top of the slope, gripping the sled's rope with hands that trembled slightly from excitement rather than cold. Care to make a wager on my sledding competence? What sort of wager? If I make it down without falling, you have to attempt the run yourself. Lord Harrington's eyebrows rose. And if you don't make it down without falling, then I'll... Sarah's mind went blank as he moved closer, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. You'll what? His voice had dropped to something that made warmth pool in places that had no business warming. I'll think of something appropriately embarrassing. Deal. He extended his gloved hand. Though I should mention, I'm rather hoping you fall. The admission made heat race through her, despite the cold air. That's hardly sporting, Lord Harrington. Richard, he said softly. When we're alone like this, I'd prefer Richard. Her name on his lips yesterday had been intimate. His given name felt like a gift she wasn't sure she deserved to accept. Richard, she repeated, testing the feel of it. That's rather forward of me. I've noticed Americans excel at being appropriately forward. Sarah launched herself down the hill before she could lose her nerve, or do something even more forward like kissing him right there at the top of the slope. The sled flew down the hill faster than she'd expected, wind whipping her hair loose from its pins, snow spraying around her in glittering clouds. She was flying, laughing, completely alive in a way she hadn't felt since childhood. The exhilaration was intoxicating, perfect freedom, combined with just enough danger to make her heart race. She was so caught up in the pure joy of speed that she forgot entirely about steering. The sled hit a hidden bump and launched sideways, sending Sarah tumbling into a snowdrift with a graceless thud that knocked the breath from her lungs. She lay still for a moment, staring up at the brilliant blue sky and laughing despite being thoroughly buried in snow. Sarah! Richard's voice carried panic as he ran down the hill. "Sarah, are you hurt?" She struggled to sit up, snow falling from her hair and coat, spectacles hanging askew. "I'm perfectly fine, though I believe you win the wager." Richard dropped to his knees beside her in the snow, his hands hovering as though he wanted to touch her, but didn't dare. "Are you certain? That looked like quite a tumble." "Nothing wounded but my pride." She reached up to straighten her spectacles and realized how close his face was to hers. Close enough to see the worry in his dark eyes, the way his breath misted in the cold air, the way his gaze dropped briefly to her lips before returning to her eyes. "Your hair," he said roughly, reaching up to brush snow from the brown strands that had escaped her pins. The gentle touch sent electricity racing through her. His fingers lingered longer than necessary, tracing snow from her cheek with a tenderness that made her forget entirely about the cold seeping through her coat. Richard. His name was barely a whisper. "Sarah." He was leaning closer, and she could see gold flecks in his eyes, could feel the warmth radiating from him despite the winter air. "Papa, Miss Mitchell, did you see my snowman's head?" Catherine's voice carried across the slope, shattering the moment like glass. Richard jerked back as though burned, scrambling to his feet and extending a hand to help Sarah up. His touch was careful now, proper, but she could feel the tension thrumming through him as he steadied her. "Magnificent snowman, Catherine," Sarah called, her voice only slightly breathless as she brushed snow from her coat. "He looks very distinguished." "He needs a proper hat, though, and maybe a pipe like Papa's." As Catherine chattered about snowman accessories, Sarah caught Richard's gaze and saw her own shaken awareness reflected there. They'd almost kissed, would have kissed, if not for an 8-year-old's perfect timing. The realization should have horrified her. Instead, it made anticipation curl warm and dangerous in her stomach. "Your turn," she said to Richard, gesturing toward the sled with forced lightness. "Though I warn you, it's rather more challenging than it appears." Richard's smile was slow, intimate, full of heat that made her forget entirely about the cold. "Sarah, I'm beginning to think you're far more dangerous than you appear." As he positioned himself at the top of the hill, Sarah watched the careful control he maintained in every movement, the way he'd pulled back the moment Catherine interrupted them. He was being honorable, protective of her reputation and his daughter's presence. But the way he'd whispered her name, the way his fingers had lingered in her hair, Richard Harrington was not nearly as controlled as he pretended to be. And Sarah was discovering she very much wanted to see what lay beneath all that careful English restraint. Chapter 7. Sarah had always considered ghost stories a peculiar English tradition, but watching the faces around her in the flickering firelight made her grateful for every spine-chilling tale. She sat beside Richard on the great sofa, close enough that when Lord Pembry described spectral footsteps echoing through empty corridors, she found herself gripping Richard's arm without conscious thought. When Lady Blackwood's story reached its climactic moment, a ghostly bride appearing in a mirror, Sarah's grip tightened involuntarily. The solid warmth of his arm beneath her fingers was infinitely more comforting than any rational argument about fictional spirits. "Absolutely terrifying," Diana declared with obvious satisfaction from her position beside Gabriel. "Eleanor, your tale about the weeping woman was inspired." Thomas helped with the dramatic elements. Eleanor replied, smiling at her husband with the contentment that came from years of happy marriage. Artists understand the importance of proper atmosphere. Around the great hall, other guests murmured appreciation for the evening's entertainment. The fire had burned low during the storytelling, casting everything in intimate golden light. Sarah noticed Catherine had fallen asleep in her armchair, dark curls tumbling over the velvet arm in a way that tugged at her heart with unexpected maternal tenderness. "I should take Catherine upstairs," Richard said quietly, noticing his daughter's peaceful slumber. "She'll be more comfortable in her own bed." Sarah nodded, releasing his arm reluctantly as he rose. She watched him lift Catherine with gentle care, the child settling trustingly against his shoulder without waking. The sight of his devoted fatherhood did something devastating to her carefully maintained emotional distance. When Richard disappeared up the staircase with Catherine, Sarah tried to focus on the continuing ghost stories, but found herself glancing repeatedly toward the empty doorway, waiting for his return with an anticipation that had nothing to do with supernatural entertainment. Richard slipped back into the great hall after settling Catherine in her bed, grateful to find the ghost stories still in progress. The group had grown smaller and more intimate during his absence. Several couples had already retired, leaving perhaps a dozen guests clustered around the dying fire. Sarah glanced up as he approached, her smile welcoming him back in a way that made warmth spread through his chest. She shifted slightly on the sofa, creating space for him to resume his seat beside her. "Did I miss anything truly terrifying?" he asked quietly as he settled next to her. Lady Blackwood just finished a tale about a weeping bride that had half the room clutching their companions, Sarah murmured back, her voice carrying amusement. "I may have developed a permanent grip on this poor cushion." Richard wished she'd been gripping his arm instead, but the thought was too forward to voice. "I believe it's time for this old married couple to retire," Marcus Pembry announced, rising and extending a hand to Lucy. "Morning comes early with enthusiastic children." Lucy accepted his assistance with a smile that still held newlywed heat despite their years of marriage. "Good night, everyone. Sweet dreams." As the Pembrys departed, other couples began making their own farewells. Within minutes, the great hall had emptied except for Richard, Sarah, and the dying fire. "Well," Sarah said softly, "that was considerably more frightening than I expected. English ghost stories have a reputation for effectiveness." Richard found himself reluctant to break the intimate atmosphere, though I suspect American tales are equally spine-chilling. We have our share of haunted houses and mysterious disappearances, though New England ghosts tend to be more practical, less romantic weeping, more stern moral instruction from beyond the grave. Richard laughed quietly. "That sounds appropriately American." "Appropriately boring, you mean?" "I didn't say boring." His voice had grown softer, more intimate now that they were alone. "I find American directness refreshing, even in ghost form." Richard turned to study her face in the firelight, his breath catching at the way the golden glow warmed her features. Her spectacles had slipped slightly down her nose, her hair had escaped its pins in soft tendrils around her face, and something in her dark eyes made his pulse race. "Richard," she said carefully, "may I ask you something rather personal?" The way she said his name made heat pool low in his stomach. "Of course. Do you ever feel as though you're simply existing, going through proper motions without actually living?" The question caught him off guard with its directness and accuracy. "What makes you ask?" "These past few days. Being here with you and Catherine, I feel more myself than I have in years, more alive." She adjusted her spectacles with nervous fingers. "But it's temporary, and that makes it somehow more precious and more painful." Richard studied the vulnerability in her expression. "Sarah, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that my carefully planned life suddenly feels rather bloodless compared to this. This house party, this Christmas, this conversation." She met his gaze directly. "You." The simple word hung between them, heavy with implication and possibility. Richard felt his careful control begin to crack under the weight of her honesty. "Sarah." Her name was rough on his lips. "You're leaving in 2 weeks. I know. You have responsibilities in Boston, students depending on you." "I know that too. Then what are you suggesting?" Richard watched her stare into the dying fire for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm simply acknowledging that some things matter more than careful planning." The admission broke something loose in Richard's chest. Before he could think better of it, before caution could reassert itself, he reached up and traced the curve of her cheek with trembling fingers. "Sarah," he said softly, "if I kiss you now, everything changes." She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed for a moment before opening to meet his gaze with devastating directness. "Perhaps it's time for things to change." Richard's restraint shattered completely. He cupped her face in his hands and lowered his mouth to hers with 3 years of careful loneliness and 2 days of building hunger behind the kiss. Sarah's lips were soft, warm, perfect beneath his. She tasted like mulled wine and Christmas spices, and something indefinably sweet that made him want to lose himself completely. When she sighed against his mouth and moved closer, Richard felt his world reorganize itself around this moment. This woman, this impossible gift he'd never expected to receive again. When they finally broke apart, both breathing unsteadily, Richard could see that her spectacles were fogged and her hair completely disheveled. She looked thoroughly kissed and absolutely beautiful. "Oh," she whispered, touching her lips with wondering fingers. "Oh, indeed." Richard's voice was hoarse with emotion and desire. "Sarah, We should go upstairs," she interrupted, though her eyes held the same reluctance he felt. "Before someone sees us." Richard nodded, though the last thing he wanted was to end this perfect moment. But propriety demanded discretion, especially with Catherine sleeping nearby and other guests potentially wandering the corridors. They walked toward the stairs in charged silence, both hyper-aware of each other's presence, both shaken by the intensity of what had just passed between them. As they reached the first landing, soft laughter echoed from the corridor ahead. Richard touched Sarah's arm, gesturing for quiet, and they paused in the shadows as Lucy and Marcus Pembry came into view near their bedroom door. Marcus had Lucy pressed gently against the wall, his hands framing her face as he murmured something that made her laugh softly before pulling him down for a kiss that spoke of years of passion and intimacy. Richard watched the tender scene with fascination, acutely aware of Sarah's reaction beside him. When the Pembrys disappeared into their room with quiet laughter, Sarah turned to him with wide eyes. "They've been married for years," she said wonderingly, "and they still look at each other like that." Happy marriages tend to improve with time rather than diminish. "Is that what you had with Elizabeth?" The question was gentle, curious rather than jealous. Richard considered his answer carefully. "Elizabeth and I grew into love gradually. What you just witnessed, that level of passion, I'm not certain I understood it was possible until... Until I kissed you," he said honestly. Sarah's breath caught audibly. "Richard?" "Good night, Sarah," he said softly before he could say something that would complicate everything further. "Sweet dreams." But as he walked toward his own room, Richard suspected sweet dreams would be impossible when all he could think about was the taste of Sarah's lips and the terrible, wonderful realization that he was falling in love with a woman who planned to sail away in 13 days. Chapter 8. Sarah woke on Christmas morning with her lips still tingling from Richard's kiss and her heart racing with possibilities she'd never allowed herself to imagine. The weak winter sunlight streaming through her bedroom windows held a different quality than previous days. Brighter, clearer, suggesting the storm clouds had finally passed. She could hear voices and laughter echoing through the corridors as house party guests began their Christmas celebrations. But all she could think about was the way Richard had whispered her name in the firelight, the way his hands had trembled as he'd traced her cheek. "Everything changes," he'd said, and everything had. Sarah dressed with unusual care, choosing her finest morning dress, deep green silk that brought out her eyes, and taking extra time with her hair. She told herself it was simply Christmas morning propriety, but the truth was she wanted to look beautiful for Richard, wanted to see that heated awareness in his dark eyes again. But when she made her way downstairs for breakfast, Richard was nowhere to be found. "Good morning, Sarah." Charlotte Sears appeared at her elbow with a warm smile and a cup of coffee. "You look lovely this morning. That color is perfect on you." "Thank you." Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully, though her eyes continued scanning the breakfast room. "Have you seen Lord Harrington this morning?" "He was here earlier with Catherine, but they've gone to the chapel for morning prayers. A Christmas tradition he maintains in Elizabeth's memory, apparently." Charlotte's expression grew understanding. Sarah tried to hide her disappointment. "Of course, how thoughtful of him." "Indeed, though I suspect he'll return soon enough." Charlotte guided Sarah toward the windows overlooking the snow-covered grounds. "The roads look much improved this morning. I imagine normal travel will resume shortly." The innocent observation sent an unexpected chill through Sarah's chest. "Yes, I suppose it will." "William mentioned your ship passage is scheduled for January 4th. That's coming up rather quickly." Sarah stared out at the brilliant white landscape, remembering Richard's words from the night before. You're leaving in 2 weeks. Now it was less than 2 weeks. 10 days, to be precise. Sarah? Charlotte's voice carried gentle concern. Is everything well? I'm not certain, Sarah admitted, turning away from the window. Charlotte, may I ask you something rather personal? Of course. Charlotte, may I ask you something rather personal? Of course. When you married William, did you ever have doubts about building a life so far from Boston, away from everything familiar? Charlotte's eyebrows rose with obvious interest. What makes you ask? Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. I suppose I'm curious about how one decides between established plans and unexpected possibilities. Ah. Charlotte's smile grew warm with understanding. This wouldn't have anything to do with a certain English gentleman who's been looking at you as though you've redefined his understanding of the world? I don't know what you mean. Sarah Mitchell. I've watched Lord Harrington during this house party. The man follows your every movement with his eyes. When you speak, he listens as though you're revealing the secrets of the universe. When you're kind to Catherine, he looks like he's witnessing miracles. Sarah's heart fluttered at Charlotte's observations. Even if that were true, I have responsibilities in Boston, students depending on me, an academy that represents 5 years of planning. All valid considerations. Charlotte settled into a chair by the window, gesturing for Sarah to join her. But may I share something I learned when facing my own impossible choice? Sarah sat reluctantly, though she was desperate for perspective from someone who'd navigated similar waters. I thought I knew exactly what I wanted from life, Charlotte continued. Independence, my own choices, freedom from anyone else's expectations. When I met William, those plans suddenly felt insufficient. Not wrong, precisely, but incomplete. What did you do? I fought it, naturally. Convinced myself that caring for him was weakness rather than strength. Nearly destroyed both our chances at happiness in the process. Sarah stared into her coffee cup, seeing her own conflict reflected in Charlotte's story. But you chose love. I chose partnership. Love, yes, but also the recognition that some opportunities transform us rather than diminish us. Charlotte reached over and squeezed Sarah's hand. Your academy will exist whether you're in Boston or London, but some chances at happiness come only once. You make it sound simple. It's terrifying, Charlotte said with a laugh, but the best decisions usually are. Before Sarah could respond, Diana Rothbury swept into the breakfast room with characteristic energy. Sarah, my dear, just the person I wanted to see. Your Grace? I've been consulting with Gabriel about travel arrangements now that the weather is clearing. Several guests are eager to return to London for New Year's celebrations. Diana settled into a chair with obvious satisfaction. We can have coaches ready by tomorrow afternoon if anyone needs immediate transport. Sarah's stomach lurched. Tomorrow? The roads should be perfectly passable by then. Though, of course, you're welcome to extend your stay as long as you'd like. Diana's smile turned knowing. I suspect certain members of our party would be devastated if you departed too hastily. Sarah's mind raced. 10 days until her ship sailed. If she left tomorrow, she'd have a week in London to finalize her affairs and prepare for the journey home. The practical choice, the safe choice, the choice that suddenly felt like abandoning everything that mattered. I should probably make arrangements for prompt departure, she heard herself saying. My obligations in Boston require immediate attention. Charlotte's expression grew concerned. Sarah, are you certain? Quite certain. This was always meant to be a brief holiday visit. The words felt like lies on her tongue, but Sarah forced herself to continue. I've been away from my responsibilities longer than planned. Of course, Diana said, though she looked disappointed. I'll have my staff make the necessary arrangements. Though I do hope you'll consider returning to England soon. You've become quite dear to all of us. As Diana departed to organize travel logistics, Charlotte turned to Sarah with obvious worry. Are you sure about this? You look as though you're making a decision that terrifies you. I'm being practical, Sarah replied, though her hands were trembling as she set down her coffee cup. This Christmas has been wonderful, but it was never meant to be permanent. I have a life waiting in Boston. And what about the life you might build here? Sarah stood abruptly, needing to escape before her resolve crumbled. Some chances aren't meant to be taken. Some risks are too great. But as she walked away from Charlotte's concerned expression and the bright promises of the Christmas morning, Sarah wondered if the greatest risk wasn't staying in England, but sailing away from the only man who'd ever made her feel truly alive. Later, when she heard Richard's voice in the entrance hall as he returned from chapel with Catherine, Sarah hid in the library rather than face him. She wasn't ready to see disappointment in his eyes when he learned of her departure plans. She wasn't ready to admit that leaving England might break her heart entirely. Chapter 9. Richard returned from chapel with Catherine to find Rothbury Abbey transformed into Christmas morning magic. The great hall sparkled with candlelight, reflecting off tinsel and ribbons, the massive tree surrounded by carefully wrapped gifts, and the air filled with laughter and excited voices as guests gathered for the traditional Christmas morning festivities. "Papa, look at all the presents," Catherine breathed, her eyes wide with wonder as she took in the scene. "Quite a sight," Richard agreed, though his gaze was searching the crowd for one particular figure. He'd thought about Sarah through the entire chapel service, remembering the taste of her lips, the way she'd leaned into his touch, the soft sigh she'd made when he'd whispered her name. "Lord Harrington!" Diana swept toward them with arms full of wrapped packages. "Perfect timing. We're just beginning the gift exchange. Catherine, my dear, there's a special something for you near the tree." Catherine needed no further encouragement, darting toward the Christmas tree with the enthusiasm only children could muster on Christmas morning. Richard followed more slowly, still scanning the room. "Looking for someone in particular?" Gabriel appeared at his elbow, amusement evident in his voice. "Miss Mitchell, I haven't seen her this morning." "Ah." Gabriel's smile grew knowing. "She's been helping organize the children's gifts with Charlotte and Lucy. Quite the natural with organization, that one." Richard finally spotted Sarah near the fireplace, kneeling beside a group of children as they unwrapped presents with careful excitement. She was laughing at something one of the Pembry twins had said, her face glowing with genuine joy that made his chest tighten with emotion. She looked beautiful, happy, completely at ease in this domestic Christmas scene. She looked like she belonged here, which made what he overheard next all the more devastating. "Everything arranged for tomorrow, then?" Diana's voice carried clearly as she approached Sarah with obvious satisfaction. "Yes, thank you so much for organizing the transport," Sarah replied, rising from her position among the children. "The early departure will give me ample time to prepare for my ship passage." Richard felt ice form in his veins. "Early departure. Tomorrow. Such a pity you can't extend your visit," Lucy Pembry added, joining the conversation. "We've all grown so fond of you." "You're very kind, but I've been away from my responsibilities longer than planned," Sarah said with a brightness that sounded forced to Richard's ears. "My academy needs immediate attention, and I have commitments to honor." Richard stood frozen among the Christmas morning chaos, watching Sarah discuss her departure with the casual efficiency of someone eager to escape. The kiss that had kept him awake all night, the connection he'd thought was mutual, the way she'd whispered his name like a prayer. Apparently, it had all meant considerably less to her than he'd assumed. "Papa!" Catherine's voice broke through his paralysis. "Look what Father Christmas brought me." Richard forced himself to smile and admire Catherine's new books, but his attention remained fixed on Sarah's conversation. Every word she spoke about departure plans felt like a blade to his chest. "She's running away," he realized with crushing clarity. The kiss terrified her, and now she's fleeing back to the safety of her planned life. He should have known better, should have remembered that American independence meant exactly that. Independence from entangling emotions that might complicate carefully laid plans. By the time the gift exchange concluded and guests began dispersing for Christmas dinner preparations, Richard's hurt had crystallized into something harder. If Sarah Mitchell wanted to pretend their kiss had been a momentary aberration, he wouldn't embarrass them both by pursuing what was clearly unwelcome. But he deserved an explanation, and she was going to give him one. Sarah sensed Richard's presence behind her before she heard his voice. "Miss Mitchell, might I have a word?" The formal address made her stomach clench. After last night's intimacy, after the way he'd whispered her name in the firelight, being called Miss Mitchell felt like a deliberate slap. She turned to find him standing rigidly straight, his expression carefully neutral in a way that reminded her painfully of their first meeting. Gone was the warmth she'd grown accustomed to, replaced by polite distance that chilled her more effectively than any winter storm. Of course, Lord Harrington. If he could retreat into formality, so could she. The flicker of pain that crossed his features at her use of his title shouldn't have satisfied her, but it did. Perhaps we might speak privately. The library should be unoccupied. Sarah nodded, following him through the corridors with mounting dread. The easy companionship of previous days had vanished, replaced by the kind of careful politeness that preceded difficult conversations and permanent goodbyes. In the library, Richard closed the door behind them and turned to face her with an expression she couldn't read. "I understand congratulations are in order," he said with cutting courtesy. "Diana mentioned your travel arrangements have been finalized." Sarah's chin lifted defensively. "I always planned to return to Boston after Christmas. Of course, how efficient of you to organize departure so quickly after recent events." The carefully neutral phrasing made heat flash through her. "What exactly are you implying?" "I'm implying nothing. Merely observing that your eagerness to leave suggests our evening by the fire was perhaps more regrettable than I realized." The accusation hit like a physical blow. "Regrettable? Come now, Sarah." Her name on his lips was sharp now, cutting rather than caressing. "We're both adults. These things happen at Christmas house parties. A moment's weakness, a romantic atmosphere, wine and firelight creating illusions of deeper feeling." Each word felt designed to wound, and Sarah realized with dawning horror that he was deliberately minimizing what had passed between them. "Is that what you think happened? A moment's weakness? What else would you call it?" Richard's voice carried brittle control. "You've made your priorities quite clear through your actions today." "My priorities?" "Your departure arrangements, your discussions of obligations that require immediate attention, your obvious relief at escaping whatever inconvenient complications our kiss might have created." Sarah stared at him in shock, seeing the pain he was trying to hide behind aristocratic dignity. He thought she was running away, thought she regretted their kiss, their connection, everything that had made her feel more alive than she had in years. "You think I want to leave?" "I think you're terrified of what might happen if you stay." The accuracy of his observation made her defensive. "Perhaps I am. Perhaps I have good reason to be." "Such as?" "Such as you're asking me to abandon everything I've worked for based on one kiss and 3 days of pleasant conversation. I haven't asked you to abandon anything. Haven't you?" Sarah's voice rose despite her efforts at control. "What else would staying in England mean? My students, my investors, my academy, all sacrificed for the sake of romantic feelings that might not survive the reality of ordinary life. So you'd rather flee than discover whether those feelings might be real? I'd rather protect what I know I can trust than risk it for what might be nothing more than Christmas sentiment." Richard's expression went cold. "I see. How very practical of you." "Yes, it is practical, and wise, and exactly what any sensible woman would do when faced with an impossible choice." "Impossible? What are you offering, Richard? What future could we possibly have? I'm an American spinster with a business to run. You're an English gentleman with an estate and a child who needs stability. Even if I stayed, what then? Marriage to a woman who resents sacrificing her life's work? Children raised by a mother who abandoned her principles for the sake of romance?" "You're right," Richard said quietly, and something in his tone made Sarah's heart sink. "It is impossible." The simple agreement felt like defeat rather than victory. Sarah had won the argument and lost something indefinably precious in the process. "I'm glad we understand each other," she managed. "Perfectly." Richard moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the handle. "I hope your return journey is pleasant, Miss Mitchell, and that your academy brings you all the satisfaction you seek." The formal farewell felt like a closing on possibilities she'd been afraid to examine too closely. Sarah watched him walk away with rigid dignity and realized she'd gotten exactly what she'd asked for, a safe return to her planned life. So why did victory feel so much like loss? That evening, Sarah sat by her bedroom window, watching the clear starlit sky and trying to convince herself she'd made the right choice. Tomorrow, she'd leave for London. In 10 days, she'd sail for Boston, and life would return to the comfortable predictability she'd worked so hard to achieve. It was sensible, logical, exactly what any independent woman would choose, and it felt like the worst mistake she'd ever made. Chapter 10. Richard stood at his bedroom window watching the sunrise paint the snow-covered grounds gold and pink, having not slept a moment since his disastrous confrontation with Sarah. Her carriage would arrive within hours to take her away forever, and the knowledge sat in his chest like a stone. Some mistakes are easily corrected, he'd said. The memory of those words made him sick with regret. He'd seen the pain flash across her face, the way her composure had cracked before she'd fled from the library with tears threatening. He'd hurt her deliberately, lashing out from his own wounded pride, and now she was leaving thinking he regretted everything between them. "Papa?" Catherine's sleepy voice interrupted his self-recrimination. "Why are you awake? It's still dark." Richard turned to find his daughter padding into his room in her nightgown, rubbing her eyes with small fists. "I couldn't sleep, sweetheart. Come here." Catherine climbed onto the window seat beside him, settling against his side with the trusting warmth that never failed to humble him. "Are you sad about something?" How to explain to an 8-year-old that he'd fallen in love with a woman he'd driven away through his own cowardice and pride? "Catherine," he said carefully, "how would you feel if we went on a very long journey to a place we'd never seen before?" "Like an adventure?" Catherine's eyes brightened with interest. "Where would we go?" "America, to Boston, where Miss Mitchell lives." Catherine was quiet for a moment, considering this with 8-year-old seriousness. "Would we live there, forever?" "Perhaps. Would that frighten you?" "Would Miss Mitchell be there?" Richard's heart clenched. "Yes, she would be there." "Then I think I'd like it very much." Catherine snuggled closer to him. "Papa, do you love Miss Mitchell?" The direct question caught him unprepared, though he should have expected it. Catherine had always possessed an uncomfortable talent for seeing through adult pretenses. "Yes," he said quietly, "I do love her." "Does she love you?" "I think she might, but she has important work in America, and I—" Richard struggled for words. An 8-year-old would understand. "I said things last night that hurt her feelings. She thinks I don't want her to have the life she's planned." "But you do want her to be happy?" "More than anything." Catherine tilted her head with that expression of concentration she'd inherited from her mother. "Then why don't we go with her? If she has to be in America to be happy and we want to be with her, then we should go to America too." The simple logic of childhood cut through all his complicated adult reasoning with devastating clarity. Why was he assuming love meant Sarah had to sacrifice everything? Why couldn't love mean he was brave enough to build something new? "Catherine," he said slowly, "would you really want to leave England, leave everything familiar?" "I want to be where you and Miss Mitchell are both happy," Catherine replied with matter-of-fact certainty. "And America sounds exciting, like an adventure story." Richard stared at his remarkable daughter, seeing Elizabeth's wisdom reflected in her dark eyes. Catherine had already lost her mother, her governess, the security of unchanging routine, yet she was willing to risk everything familiar for the possibility of a complete family. If an 8-year-old could be that brave, what excuse did he have for cowardice? "Catherine," Richard said, his voice rough with emotion, "how quickly can you pack your favorite things?" "Very quickly. Are we going to chase Miss Mitchell?" "We're going to ask if she'd like some traveling companions for her journey home." Catherine bounced with excitement. "Oh, Papa, she'll say yes, won't she? Because she loves us too?" Richard hoped his daughter's confidence was justified. "I don't know, sweetheart, but we're going to find out." Sarah stood in the entrance hall of Rothbury Abbey with her packed trunks, trying to convince herself that the hollow ache in her chest was travel anxiety rather than heartbreak. The morning had been a blur of farewells and kind wishes from guests who'd become unexpectedly dear during their brief acquaintance. Diana had hugged her with genuine affection. Eleanor had pressed a small watercolor sketch into her hands as a remembrance, and Lucy had extracted promises to write regularly about her academy's progress. Richard, notably, had been absent from all farewell activities. The carriage should arrive any moment, Diana said with forced cheer, though her eyes held disappointment. The roads are perfectly clear now. You should make excellent time to London. Thank you for everything. This Christmas has been. Sarah's voice caught, and she had to clear her throat before continuing. Unforgettable. My dear, Diana said gently, are you certain about this hasty departure? Yesterday you seemed so happy here. Yesterday she'd been living in a dream where handsome widowers kissed her by firelight and whispered her name like a benediction. Today she was facing reality where such men made it clear that kisses were mistakes easily corrected. I'm certain, Sarah lied. Very well, though I do hope you'll consider returning to England soon. You've made quite an impression on Miss Mitchell. Sarah turned to see Catherine running toward her with obvious distress, still in her dressing gown and slippers despite the early hour. Behind her came Richard, moving with urgent purpose that made Sarah's pulse stutter despite her anger. Catherine, you shouldn't be downstairs without proper attire, Sarah said automatically, though her gaze was fixed on Richard's face. Papa says we're going with you, Catherine announced breathlessly. To America, on a ship, is that true? Are we really coming with you? Sarah's world tilted sideways. I beg your pardon? Richard stepped forward, his expression more vulnerable than she'd ever seen it. Sarah, I owe you an apology. Several apologies, in fact. I don't understand. I understand you're leaving because you think I expect you to choose between your dreams and this. He gestured between them with a hand that trembled slightly. But I don't want you to choose. I want to come with you. Sarah stared at him in shock. Come with me? To Boston, to your academy, to wherever you need to be to feel fulfilled and happy. Richard's voice grew stronger with each word. I was wrong to assume love meant you had to sacrifice everything familiar. Perhaps love means I should be brave enough to embrace something entirely new. Richard, you can't be serious. Your estate, your responsibilities, can be managed by stewards and solicitors. Catherine is my only real responsibility, and she's eager for American adventures. Richard stepped closer, hope beginning to replace the careful distance in his eyes. Sarah, what if you didn't have to choose between your academy and a family? What if you could have both? But Catherine wants to see America and meet your students and learn about independence from the bravest woman I've ever met, Richard interrupted. We talked this morning. She's more excited about this possibility than anything since Elizabeth's death. Sarah looked down at Catherine, who was practically vibrating with excitement. Is that true, sweetheart? Oh, yes. Papa says American children go to school with boys and girls together, and that sounds much more interesting than boring English lessons. And I want to see your academy and help teach the little children and maybe learn to be independent like you. The innocent enthusiasm was devastating. Sarah turned back to Richard, searching his face for any sign of duty or resignation. She found only determination and something that looked remarkably like joy. Richard, you'd be giving up everything. Your home, your country, everything familiar. I'd be gaining everything that matters. He reached for her hands, his touch warm and steady despite the tremor she could feel in his fingers. Sarah, these past few days with you have shown me what I've been missing. Not just companionship or help with Catherine, but partnership, joy, the feeling that life is something to be lived rather than simply endured. But it's such a risk. The greatest risk would be letting you sail away thinking I didn't love you enough to follow you anywhere. The simple declaration broke something loose in Sarah's chest. You love me? Desperately, completely. Enough to learn American customs and eat strange food and figure out how an English gentleman might contribute to a ladies' academy in Boston. Richard's smile was soft, vulnerable, utterly sincere. I love you enough to stop asking you to fit into my life and start building a life that fits us both. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes behind her spectacles. Richard, say yes, Sarah. Say you'll let us come with you. Say you'll let me spend the rest of my life proving that love doesn't require sacrifice from only one person. Around them, the entrance hall had filled with house party guests, drawn by Catherine's excited announcements and the obvious drama unfolding. Sarah was dimly aware of encouraging murmurs and knowing smiles, but all her attention was focused on Richard's face, on the love and hope and determination she saw there. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes, of course, yes." Richard's smile was brilliant as he swept her into his arms, spinning her around while Catherine cheered and the assembled guests burst into applause. When he set her down, his eyes were suspiciously bright. "When do we sail?" he asked. "January 4th, though we'll need to book additional passage." "Already arranged," Diana interrupted with obvious satisfaction. "I took the liberty of sending inquiries yesterday when I suspected this might develop. There are excellent accommodations available on the Britannica." "You arranged passage before we'd even decided?" Sarah asked in amazement. "My dear," Diana replied with a grin that reminded Sarah why the Duchess was renowned for her successful matchmaking. "I've been orchestrating Christmas miracles for years. This one was particularly obvious." As the guests dispersed with congratulations and wedding predictions, Richard caught Sarah's hand and brought it to his lips. "Are you certain about this? About us? I'm certain that 3 days ago, I thought I knew exactly what I wanted from life. Now I know what I need." Sarah met his gaze with all the honesty she possessed. "I need you. Both of you. Adventure, partnership, love, all of it." "Then we shall have it all," Richard promised, "starting with an Atlantic crossing and whatever waits beyond." Sarah thought of her academy, her students, the life she'd built, and realized that sharing it with Richard and Catherine wouldn't diminish it, but transform it into something richer than she'd ever imagined possible. Sometimes the greatest adventures began not with careful planning, but with the courage to say yes to love. We hope you have enjoyed this presentation of The Widower's Christmas Wish, written by Violet Sinclair, narrated by Isadora Blythe.